The small Welsh village where Elara lived was a place of soft grey skies and constant, gentle rain. It was a quiet place, and for Elara, it had become a lonely one. For many years, her life had been filled with caring for her aging parents. She had cooked their meals, read to them, and kept their small home tidy. She was a kind and sturdy young woman, but now that they were gone, the little house felt terribly empty. She had no brothers or sisters, and the future seemed to stretch before her like a long, misty road leading nowhere. One afternoon, while tidying the small village library, a faded newspaper caught her eye. It was called the Matrimonial Times. Curious, Elara flipped through the pages. They were filled with advertisements from people all over the world looking for husbands and wives. Her heart beat a little faster as she read. Then one advertisement in particular made her stop. It was from a man named Thomas Riggs, a rancher in Oregon, America. He was seeking a sturdy, pious woman of good character for a wife. He valued honesty and hard work and disliked frivolity. Elara read the words again and again. She was all of those things. She was not frivolous. She was a hard worker. A tiny, fragile spark of hope began to glow inside her chest. Perhaps her future did not have to be in this rainy village. Perhaps a new life, with a family of her own, was waiting across the ocean that night by the light of a single candle. Elara wrote a letter to Mr. Thomas Riggs. She told him about herself, about her life in Wales, and her love for simple, honest things. She did not have a photograph to send, but she described herself as plainly as she could. Weeks later, a reply arrived. His letter was short and direct, just like his advertisement. He agreed that she sounded suitable and invited her to come to Oregon. Object matrimony, he wrote. The train ride was a long and tumbling dream of changing landscapes. Elara watched wide-eyed as the crowded cities of the east gave way to vast, golden plains and then to towering, snow-capped mountains. She clutched her carpetbag tightly, her knuckles white. Each clack of the train wheels on the track seemed to whisper a question. What would he be like? Would he be kind? Would he think her too plain? She practiced her smile in the faint reflection of the window, hoping it was enough. Finally, the conductor called out her destination. Willow Creek, Oregon. Her heart leapt into her throat. She smoothed her best dress, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the wooden platform. The Oregon sun was bright and clear, so different from the gentle grey light of home. It felt like a spotlight. She scanned the platform, and her eyes found a man standing alone. He was tall and stern-looking, with a face that seemed carved from stone. He was not handsome, but he looked strong and capable. This had to be Thomas Riggs. He saw her and walked over, his boots making firm sounds on the planks. He did not smile. His eyes were a cool, flat grey. He looked her up and down, a quick, efficient inspection. His gaze lingered for a moment on her hands, which were rough from years of work. He gave a short, almost satisfied nod. Then his eyes moved to her face. The bright, unforgiving sun fell directly upon her, illuminating the countless freckles that dusted her nose, her cheeks, her forehead. His expression changed instantly. The slight approval vanished, replaced by a look of sharp displeasure. A deep frown line appeared between his brows. His lips pressed into a thin, hard line. Elara's hopeful smile began to falter under his cold stare. His voice was as rough and unwelcoming as she imagined the Oregon wilderness to be. The photograph you sent did not show all these spots, he said. His tone was accusing, as if she had tried to trick him. Elara's hand flew instinctively to her cheek. My freckles, sir, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They are from the sun. I have always had them. I was very clear in my letter, he stated, his words like chips of ice. I require a plain woman. This is not plain. This is flawed. It is mottled. You look as if you have been splattered with mud. I cannot have a wife who looks like this. The words were not just heard. They were felt. They landed like physical blows, each one stealing the air from her lungs. The fragile hope that had carried her across a continent shattered into a million pieces. She stood frozen, her face burning with a shame so deep and profound. She wished the platform would open up and swallow her whole. He did not ask about her character. He did not care about her skills or her heart. He saw only her freckles and found her worthless. Without another word, he turned his back on her. The stagecoach back east leaves tomorrow, he said over his shoulder. I will not be paying your fare. And then he was gone. Elara was left utterly alone on the platform, the vastness of America stretching out around her. She had no money, no friends, and no future. The bright sun that had revealed her supposed flaws now seemed to mock her. and the new world she had dreamed of felt colder and crueler than any winter she had ever known. Elara stood on the wooden platform for what felt like an eternity, yet also only a single painful heartbeat. The world had not ended, though she felt as if it had. The sun continued to shine, the birds continued to sing, and the people of Willow Creek continued to go about their business. But for Elara, everything had stopped. The sounds of the town, the creak of a wagon wheel, the distant lowing of a cow, all of it seemed to be happening on the other side of a thick, cold pane of glass. She was completely alone inside a bubble of the most profound humiliation and despair she had ever known. Her carpet bag, which held all her worldly possessions, felt like it was filled with stones at her feet. She had no plan. She had no money for a return ticket, even if she had wanted to go back to a home that was no longer there. She was truly and utterly stranded, a castaway on a foreign shore before her new life had even begun. The weight of it pressed down on her, and she felt her knees tremble, threatening to buckle. She focused on a single crack in the wooden plank beneath her boots, wishing she could simply disappear into it, unseen by Elara. The entire painful exchange had been witnessed from a short distance away. Sheriff John McCullough had been standing in the open doorway of his office, enjoying a brief moment of sunshine before returning to his paperwork. He knew Thomas Riggs by reputation, a hard and unsmiling man, and he had been curious to see the woman who had arrived to marry him. He had watched the man's face transform from assessment to disgust, seen the cruel set of his mouth as he spoke, and witnessed the way the woman's hopeful posture crumpled like a paper flower in the rain. A deep frown etched itself on John's own face. He was a man who believed in fairness and decency, and what he had just seen was neither fair nor decent. It was an act of pure, unkind cruelty. He watched as Thomas Riggs turned his back and walked away without a second glance, leaving the woman standing there, shattered. A hot spark of anger flashed behind John's eyes. That was no way to treat anyone, least of all a person who had travelled so far based on a promise. His sense of duty, and something far deeper, a simple human compassion, compelled him to move. He settled his wide-brimmed hat back on his head and walked across the dusty street, his steps measured and calm. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. She was so lost in her misery, she did not even see him until he was a few feet away. He could see the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, though she was fighting desperately to keep them from falling. Her hands were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at her sides. She looked so alone it made his heart ache. He stopped a respectful distance away and spoke in a soft, low voice, the kind one might use to approach a frightened animal. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, gently tipping his hat. "My name is John McCullough. I am the sheriff here in Willow Creek." He paused, giving her a moment to process his words. She looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw not just sadness, but a flicker of fear. She likely expected more scorn, more rejection. "I could not help but notice you might be in a spot of trouble," he continued, keeping his tone even and kind. That was no way for a man to act. "I am truly sorry you were treated so poorly on your arrival in our town." Elara could only stare at him, her mind struggling to catch up. This man was not angry at her. He was apologizing to her. The kindness in his voice, so unexpected and so welcome, was almost worse than the cruelty. It threatened to break the fragile dam holding back her tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She simply nodded, a quick, jerky motion. "I know you have nowhere to go," Sheriff McCullough said, stating the simple, awful truth. "And we cannot have that. It is not safe, and it is not right. Now, I might have a solution, if you are willing to hear it." He waited for her nod before continuing. "My sister Martha, she runs the boarding house just down the street there." He pointed toward a 2-story whitewashed building with a welcoming porch. "She is always run of her feet and is in need of a reliable helper. The work is honest. It involves cleaning, cooking, serving meals. It is not easy, but it is fair. And it comes with a small room of your own to stay in. No strings attached. It would give you a place to be while you figure out your next steps." He laid the offer out simply and clearly. It was not a grand rescue. It was a practical, decent offer of work and shelter. To Elara, however, it sounded like the most beautiful promise she had ever heard. It was a lifeline thrown to her just as she was about to go under the waves of her despair. The tightness in her chest loosened just a fraction. A room, work, a chance to breathe. She would not have to sleep on the street. She would not have to beg. She could earn her keep. She found her voice, though it was hoarse and unsteady. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her words thick with the emotion she was fighting to control. I would be very grateful. I am a hard worker. "I promise I will not be a burden. I do not doubt that for a moment," Sheriff McCullough said, and she could tell he meant it. He bent down and picked up her heavy carpet bag as if it weighed nothing. "Shall we go and introduce you to Martha? She does not bite, I promise." He offered her a small, reassuring smile, the first genuine smile anyone had given her since she arrived in this new country. Elara nodded again, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She fell into step beside him, walking away from the empty platform where her dreams had ended, and toward the boarding house where a new, uncertain future was beginning. She kept her head down, still ashamed of her face, still hurting from the rejection, but the paralyzing terror had receded. The sheriff's quiet, steady presence beside her was a shield against the world's cruelty. He had asked for nothing in return for his kindness. He had simply seen someone in need and offered help. For the first time since Thomas Riggs had spoken his hateful words, Elara felt a tiny, fragile ember of hope begin to glow once more in the cold ashes of her heart. It was not the hope of a grand romance anymore. It was a simpler, sturdier hope. The hope of a safe place to sleep, a day's work to do, and the kindness of a stranger who had seen her not as a collection of flaws, but as a person worthy of help. The boarding house was a world of its own, a place of constant motion and warm, comforting smells. It was called a restful traveler, and to Elara, its name felt like a promise. Martha, Sheriff John's sister, was a whirlwind of energy with a kind face and flour-dusted apron. She did not ask difficult questions or stare at Elara's freckles. She simply took one look at her brother's serious expression and the last look in the young woman's eyes and opened her arms and her home. She showed Elara to a small, plain room under the eaves. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a little window that looked out over the town's main street. To Elara, it was a palace. It was a space that was hers alone, a sanctuary. The next morning, her new life began before the sun had properly risen. The world of the restful traveler operated on a strict and demanding schedule. There were floors to be scrubbed until they shone, beds to be stripped and remade with crisp linens, and a vast cast iron stove that needed constant feeding to cook the meals for the guests. The work was harder than anything Elara had ever done, a relentless cycle of cleaning and cooking from dawn until long after dusk. Her arms ached from beating carpets. Her back protested from hours spent bent over a mop bucket. But she welcomed the exhaustion. The physical labor gave her mind a rest from its circling thoughts of shame and failure. She attacked every task with a fierce determination, wanting to prove herself worthy of the chance she had been given. She was quiet and kept to herself at first, a shadow moving through the halls of the boarding house. She was painfully aware of her face, convinced that every guest who glanced at her was noticing her freckles and judging her. She developed a habit of looking down at the floor when she served meals, focusing on the plates she carried rather than the faces of the people she served. She spoke only when necessary, her Welsh accent feeling thick and foreign to her own ears. The hurt from Thomas Riggs's rejection was a fresh wound, and she protected it with silence and hard work. But the rhythm of the boarding house and the unwavering kindness of its mistress began to work on her slowly, like water smoothing a rough stone. Martha was a natural teacher and a fair boss. She showed Elara how to knead bread dough until it was elastic and smooth, how to tell if a cake was done by pressing a finger lightly to its top, and the best way to get a stubborn stain out of a tablecloth. She praised Elara's quick learning and her strong work ethic. Little by little, Elara started to feel less like an outsider and more like a useful part of a small, busy community. And then there was Sheriff John. His visits to the boarding house became the brightest points in her long days. He came to see his sister, he said, but he always made a point to find Elara. He would sit on a stool in the kitchen while she peeled a mountain of potatoes or chopped vegetables for the evening stew. At first, his presence made her nervous, but his ease and his gentle way of talking soon put her at ease. He asked her real questions, not just polite ones. He wanted to know about the village in Wales where she grew up. He asked what the rain there smelled like, and if the hills were truly as green as he had heard. He listened intently as she described the sound of her language and the taste of the foods from home. In return, he shared stories of his own life. He told her funny tales about his job, about the time he had to chase a pig all through town because it had gotten loose from Mr. Henderson's pen. He told her about coming to Oregon as a boy with his family on a wagon train, and the awe he felt seeing the vast, untouched land for the first time. He spoke of the responsibilities of being sheriff, not with boastfulness, but with a deep and sincere sense of duty to the people of his town. He talked to her as an equal, his voice a calm and steady rumble that made the kitchen feel like the safest place in the world. One evening, after a particularly long day, Elara was wiping down the last of the dining tables. She was tired, but it was a good tired, the tiredness that comes from a day of honest accomplishment. John was there, finishing a cup of coffee. He made a comment about one of the guests, a harmless observation, and without thinking, Elara replied with a witty remark of her own. For a second, there was silence. Then John let out a genuine, hearty laugh. The sound was so warm and unexpected that it startled her. And then she did something she had not done since arriving in Oregon. She laughed too. It was a quiet sound at first, but it was real. It was the sound of a weight beginning to lift. She did not notice it happening at first, but gradually she began to change. She started to look up when she carried plates to the table, offering a small, shy smile to the guests. She began to take pride in her work, in the shine of the floors and the fluffiness of the bread. The boarding house was no longer just a hiding place. It was becoming a home, and the friendship growing between her and the kind sheriff was a gentle light, slowly coaxing her out of the shadows of her disappointment and teaching her that her worth was not determined by the opinion of one cruel man, but by the content of her own character and the kindness she offered to the world. The friendship between Elara and Sheriff John became a settled and comfortable part of life in Willow Creek. As the weeks melted into months, their conversations in the warm kitchen of the boarding house grew longer and more familiar. It was no longer just a matter of him visiting his sister. He found reasons to stop by, often timing his arrival for the late afternoon, when Elara's most strenuous chores were finished. He would ask if she needed anything from the mercantile, or if she would mind a bit of company on a walk. The fresh air would do them both good, he said. Martha would just smile knowingly and shoo them out the door, telling them not to be late for supper. These walks became their cherished ritual. They would stroll along the path that followed the chattering stream at the edge of town, or sometimes just amble down the dusty main street, nodding to the other townsfolk. The vast Oregon sky would blaze with colors as the sun began to set, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. On one such evening, the light was particularly golden, streaming through the leaves of the cottonwood trees that lined the bank of the stream. It was the kind of light that seeks out every detail, and it fell directly upon Elara's face, setting her constellation of freckles aglow. Without even thinking, Elara flinched. It was an old, ingrained habit, a reflex born from the memory of a cold voice and a look of disgust. She quickly turned her face away, letting her hair fall like a curtain to shield her cheek. She focused very hard on a rock near her feet, her previous ease vanishing in an instant. She wished the earth would swallow her, or that a cloud would hurry to cover the revealing sun. John noticed her sudden movement and the way her cheerful demeanor closed up like a flower at night. He understood immediately. He had heard the story of her rejection, of course, and he had seen the way she sometimes tried to make herself small and unnoticeable. A deep sense of protectiveness rose in him, mixed with a fierce anger at the man who had made this kind and wonderful woman feel ashamed of something so inherently a part of her. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. His voice was quiet and thoughtful when he spoke, not filled with the empty flattery she might have expected from someone trying to make her feel better. Instead, his tone was one of genuine curiosity and wonder. "You know," he began, his gaze soft and serious, "I have always thought freckles were a truly remarkable thing." Elara kept her face turned away, her shoulders tense. She braced herself for a joke or worse, pity. "Please," she whispered, her voice tight. "Do not mock me. I would never," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was so absolute it made her risk a glance at him. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite name. It was a look of pure admiration. "I am completely serious. I think they are like a map." This was so unexpected that Elara's head turned fully toward him, her confusion breaking through her shame. "A map?" she asked, bewildered. What could he possibly mean? "A map," he repeated, his voice warm and sure. He gently reached out, and with the utmost respect, his touch as light as a butterfly's wing, he traced a slow, invisible line across the curve of her cheekbone. "A map of all the places the sun has loved your face. Every single one is a tiny kiss of light, a little memory of a bright and happy day. I think they are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." No one in Elara's entire life had ever called her Freckles beautiful. To her, They had been a curse, a flaw, the reason for her greatest humiliation. They were the mark that had made her unlovable. But in John's calm, steady eyes, they were transformed. They were not a mistake. They were a story. They were a record of sunshine and joy. They were unique to her, a part of her history written on her skin. His words did not feel like a compliment designed to make her blush. They felt like a simple statement of fact, as true and real as the stream flowing beside them or the solid ground beneath their feet. He was not looking at a flaw Thomas Riggs had pointed out. He was looking at her. He saw the whole of her, and in his eyes, every part was worthy. The tight knot of shame that had been lodged in Elara's chest for months finally completely unraveled. A warmth spread through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. It was the warmth of being truly seen and accepted. A slow, real smile touched her lips, and for the first time, she did not try to hide it or lower her face. She looked right back at him, her eyes shining with a gratitude so profound it threatened to bring tears. In that moment, under the golden Oregon sky, Elara understood the vast difference between the two men. One had seen her as an object to be critiqued and found wanting. The other saw her as a person to be known and cherished. One had offered a contract. The other was offering, with his simple, heartfelt words, the first precious seeds of something real. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train, Elara felt not just hope, but a flicker of something else, something brighter and more wonderful. She felt the first gentle stirrings of true love. Thomas Riggs was a man who prided himself on his judgment. He believed in order, efficiency, and clear standards. He ran his ranch with an iron will and expected the same level of control over his personal life. His rejection of the Welsh woman had been, in his mind, a simple matter of quality control. She had not met the specifications laid out in his advertisement. She was flawed goods, and he had no use for her. He had put the entire unfortunate episode out of his mind, or so he told himself, and returned to the solitary rhythm of his work. The ranch demanded everything from him, and it was a demand he was happy to meet. It was simpler than people, but a small town is like a living thing, and its whispers have a way of drifting on the wind, even onto an isolated ranch. The story of the mail order bride left on the platform was too juicy a piece of gossip to fade away quickly. Thomas began to hear things, snippets of conversation when he came into town for supplies. He heard them at the mercantile and outside the blacksmith shop. At first, he dismissed them. He did not care what became of the woman. That was her problem, not his. Yet the whispers persisted, and they began to paint a picture that was deeply unsettling to his sense of how the world should work. He heard that the sheriff had stepped in and found her a position at the boarding house. He heard that she was a hard worker, the best helper Martha McCullough had ever had. People said the bread she baked was the lightest in the county, and that the boarding house had never been so clean or so welcoming. The story was no longer about his rejection. It was about her resilience. Then he saw them. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he was in town to pick up a new harness. He saw Sheriff John McCullough and the Welsh woman, Elara, walking together down the boardwalk. He stopped dead in his tracks, partially hidden by a post, and watched. The change in her was what struck him first. This was not the hunched, ashamed creature he had left on the platform. She stood straight and walked with a quiet confidence. She was smiling at something the sheriff said, and her face was turned up to his, completely open and unguarded. The setting sun caught her features, and those same freckles he had found so offensive now seemed to sparkle. She looked happy. She looked pretty. A strange and unpleasant feeling coiled in his stomach. It was a sour mix of surprise, confusion, and something else he was reluctant to name. It was regret. He watched the easy way the sheriff leaned toward her, the respectful way he listened when she spoke. He saw the way the townsfolk they passed greeted them both with genuine warmth. They were a picture of quiet contentment, a pair. Thomas Riggs was suddenly, acutely aware of his own isolation. The silence of his ranch house, which he had always valued, now seemed vast and empty. The woman he had dismissed as worthless was being valued by everyone else. She was building a life, a good life, in the very town he had sent her away from. He had been so focused on a superficial flaw that he had been blind to everything else. He had not seen her strength of character, her work ethic, or her gentle nature. He had wanted a sturdy, practical wife, and he had sent away the very embodiment of those qualities because of a few spots on her skin. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. His impeccable judgment, his pride, felt foolish and shallow. For a brief, wild moment, he considered action. He could go to her. He could apologize. He could explain that he had been wrong, that he had made a terrible mistake. But as he watched her laugh at something John said, the moment passed. He saw the way she looked at the sheriff with a trust and affection that was plain for anyone to see. It was too late. His chance was gone. He had not just rejected a woman. He had rejected his own future happiness based on a foolish vanity he had not even known he possessed. He turned away from the sight of them, the new harness feeling heavy in his hand. He walked back to his wagon alone, the sounds of the happy town fading behind him. The road back to his ranch seemed longer and lonelier than ever before. He was left with nothing but the silent, empty house and the cold, unwelcome knowledge that his greatest error had not been in sending her away, but in failing to see her true worth in the first place. He was a man who had judged a book by its cover, and now someone else was enjoying the beautiful story inside. The change in Elara was like a flower blooming after a long winter. The quiet, hesitant woman who had tried to make herself small was gone. In her place was someone who walked through the town of Willow Creek with her head held high. She greeted people by name. She shared recipes with other women at the mercantile. She no longer saw her reflection in a window and quickly looked away. The freckles on her face were simply a part of her, a detail as natural as the color of her eyes or the sound of her laughter. And she laughed often now, a warm, genuine sound that made others smile in return. This new confidence was a gift, and she knew exactly who had given it to her. Sheriff John McCullough watched this transformation with a heart so full of love he thought it might burst. He saw not just her beauty, but her strength, her kindness, and the gentle way she had woven herself into the fabric of the town. He knew, without a single doubt, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life making sure she never felt lonely or unloved again. He wanted to be the reason she smiled every single day. He planned it for a perfect evening. The sky was a deep, clear blue, and the first brave stars were beginning to twinkle overhead. The air was warm and carried the scent of wildflowers from the nearby fields. He asked her to walk with him to their favorite spot by the stream, the very place where he had told her freckles were a map of the sun's kisses. They walked in a comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water chatter over the stones. Finally, John stopped and turned to face her, taking both of her work-worn hands in his own. His hands were strong and capable, and they held hers with a tenderness that made her heart beat faster. He looked into her eyes, his gaze steady and sincere. "Elara," he began, his voice a soft, serious rumble. "I need you to know something. A man who could look at you and only see a flaw is a man who is blind to true beauty." He saw a spot on the surface. "I see the wonderful person you are deep down. I see your courage for coming here all alone. I see your strength in building a new life from nothing. I see your kindness in every loaf of bread you bake and every room you clean. I see your beautiful heart." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I see the sun's artwork on your face, and I love it. But more than that, I love you. I love all of you, every single part. Will you do me the greatest honor? Will you be my wife?" Tears filled Elara's eyes, but they were tears of pure, unshadowed joy. She did not need to think about her answer. She had found what she had come across an ocean to find, not in the man who had advertised for a wife, but in the kind and decent man who had offered her a hand when she had fallen. She had found a love that was based on friendship, respect, and truly seeing one another. "Yes," she whispered, her voice strong and clear. "Oh, John, yes." 1,000 times yes. His face broke into a radiant smile, and he pulled her into a warm, secure embrace. Under the vast, starry Oregon sky, by the gentle stream, they held each other. Two souls who had found their perfect home in one another. Their wedding was a small, simple affair held in the town church, surrounded by their friends and family. Martha stood beaming by Elara's side. The entire town came to celebrate, for everyone loved the sheriff and had grown to adore the hard-working, kind woman from Wales. Elara wore a simple, a lovely dress, and she did not wear powder or try to hide her face. She stood proudly beside her husband-to-be, her freckles on full display, a testament to the journey that had brought her here. As she said her vows, she looked into John's kind blue eyes and saw her future. It was not a future of grand riches or easy times, but it was a future built on the solid foundation of true love and mutual respect. She had been rejected for the very thing her true love adored most. She had crossed an ocean seeking a dream, only to have it shattered, and then had found a reality far more beautiful than any dream could ever be. She was no longer a mail order bride. She was Elara McCullough, She was loved. She was home. The end.